Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth Incite of 2024. My name is Dylan Schroeder, and I am the librarian on the cultural programming team here at the Vancouver Public Library. And I would like to thank the Writers' Fest for their continued partnership with us. Without them, these amazing Incite events would not happen. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh Nations. As we gather to celebrate these exciting debut novels tonight, I would encourage everyone to find and support debuts by Indigenous authors coming out this year as well, such as All I See Is Violence by Angela Lita Newell or Looking for Smoke by K.A. Kobal. Now, a few housekeeping things before we get started. The emergency exit is just out the door and up the stairs through the main entrance. We'll lead everybody out there if we need to. The washrooms are just out the door and to the right. And we do ask that if you have to leave to use the washroom during the performance, you just go out the back door there, as it's less disruptive, and then you can also come back in through that door. We've also now got a water fountain down here in the aisles, which is very exciting. So if you need to fill up your water bottle or get a drink, you can do that right there. Now, tonight, we are extremely fortunate to have Lily Wang and Scott Alexander Howard both making their literary debuts in the building with us tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a very special evening. And so now I'm going to turn the event over to Leslie Hertig, the artistic director of the Vancouver Writers' Fest, to talk more about the festival and to introduce tonight's guests. Big round of applause, everybody.
Thanks so much, Dylan, and thank you to Candy as well for having us here at the Vancouver Public Library. Good evening and welcome to Incite. What a pleasure it is to see you all here in person, and hello to those of you who are watching from home this evening. We are delighted. I love an evening when we are welcoming debut authors to the stage. It's a chance for us to meet new writers and to be the ones to discover these new voices, whom I have a feeling we will be hearing a lot more from as the years go on. Silver Repetition by Lily Wang and The Other Valley by Scott Alexander Howard dropped on my desk as manuscripts in the summertime. And it was just as I was heading off on vacation. Each of these worlds that the authors have woven are so immersive. I feel like I just read them yesterday. I'm still thinking about those characters that I first read about back in August. I'm excited for you to enter that world as well, those worlds as well, and really glad that it worked out to have them both here tonight in conversation with the wonderful Tara McGuire. Tonight, we are grateful as ever to our Incite partner, the Vancouver Public Library, for giving us this space to gather in. And I'd also like to say thank you to our government sponsors that make our work possible. They are the Government of Canada, the Government of British Columbia, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. For those of you who are new to Incite and to the Vancouver Writers' Fest, this free series runs from January through till the beginning of June, just about every other Wednesday. We'll be updating our website regularly, so make sure you check that out. In the meantime, I can tell you that our next Incite event on March 20th will be featuring formerly of the Globe and Mail, Elizabeth Renzetti and Kate Hilton, with their first joint book. It's what you would call a cozy mystery called Bury the Lead. It's really great for those of you who love a good page turner, love a cozy mystery, cozy thriller. Make sure you turn out for that one. In just a few moments, I will be welcoming our host tonight, celebrated writer Tara McGuire, and she's going to introduce Lily and Scott. They're going to chat for about an hour before turning it over to you here in our audience, as well as our audience at home, to ask some questions of your own. And then following that conversation and those questions, Lily and Scott will be signing copies of their book over here. Books tonight are for sale courtesy of our wonderful festival partner, Black Bond Book Warehouse, and I encourage you to pick up copies of these two wonderful titles. Now to introduce you to our host. Tara McGuire is a writer and a broadcaster. Her first book, Holden After Before, Love Letter for a Son Lost to Overdose, a hybrid work in memoir and fiction, was recognized by the Walrus as one of the favorite books of 2022 as chosen by Canadian authors, and was a finalist for the 2023 City of Vancouver Book Award. She's just about one of my favorite moderators. Please welcome Tara McGuire to the stage.
Okay. Keep this here so I know what time it is. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and hello at home. It's always exciting to talk about books. I just love it. It's one of my favorite things to do. So think about any questions you might have for later, and folks at home, you can send in your questions too, and I will read them from the magic iPad later on. I guess I don't need these right now either. Okay, it's great to be here with you all in person. It feels like that doesn't happen very much recently, so that's always spectacular to just be here and feel the energy in the room. I would like to introduce you to these two talented writers. First, Lily Wang, born in Shanghai, China, and immigrated to Canada at the age of 6. They have an MA in English and Creative Writing from the University of Toronto, where they now live, not at the university, although I hear they have a key to the bathroom. So they can deke in anytime. They are the author of the poetry collections Everyone in Your Dream Is You and Saturn Peach, and their first and beautiful novel, Silver Repetition. Lindsay Wong had this to say about Silver Repetition: fiercely poetic and luminous with surrealist imagery, Silver Repetition is a deeply moving and humane exploration of fractured self, deep longing, lost memories, diaspora, and aching family ties. Here is a gorgeous book that reads like a luxury dreamscape from beginning to end. Please welcome Lily Wang. I did that without my glasses. That was impressive. And Scott Alexander Howard has a PhD in philosophy, also from the U of T, but we found out they didn't cross paths. They weren't there at the same time, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, where his work focused on the relationship between memory, emotion, and literature, which is basically where I live. I don't know if you live at that intersection as well. The Other Valley is an instant bestseller. Today it landed on the Toronto Star list of best-selling Canadian fiction, and also took the #1 spot on the Vancouver Sun's list of best-selling international fiction, and it has been optioned by Working Title to be made into a series, hopefully. We'll see. We'll believe it when it happens, right? Yeah. Somewhere in the time-space continuum.
I believe it.
I believe it too. Kevin Chong, who we're all big fans of, I'm sure, a Scotia Giller Prize finalist and the author of The Double Life of Benson Yu, says, in The Other Valley, Scott Alexander Howard takes an ingenious conceit and wraps it in a story of teenage love to explore eternal questions about second chances and predestination. Howard's novel is sensitively written, propulsively plotted, and unforgettable. We're so lucky to have both of you here with us tonight. Thank you for being here one more time. All right. Well, I guess my first question is, how is it going? Both of you have written poetry and, of course, a lot of, no doubt, academic writing, but these are your first novels. So the question is, how has the experience of producing and now publishing a novel been for you?
Scott, you go first.
Well, I mean, you've actually written and published books before. This is my first publication at all, I mean, other than academic work. So for me, I don't know, it's been kind of a learning curve, actually. Like, it's sort of humbling. You know, it's most of the time you don't know what you don't know, and so you don't know what's a mountain, what's a molehill, you know. The whole process has been kind of fairly overwhelming, honestly.
Yeah. How about you, Lily? Overwhelmed?
Not really. It's true. I have been outed as a poet. It's a very different experience publishing fiction and poetry. There's a lot more editing that comes with when you've written when you've written a messy manuscript. You just have to edit it more. But yeah, I published poetry because I really wanted to be a part of the writing community, and everyone, especially poets, they're so kind. But my wish was always to be a fiction writer, and I think the major difference for me is just its desire input. So because I had way more hopes for fiction and the stakes were higher for me, I put more into it, and so it was scarier and there was more work. And I'm sure people whose dream is to publish poetry, they might feel the opposite when they put everything into a collection of poems.
As both of your books are so very new and people may not have had a chance to read them yet, I'd like to ask you both to give a synopsis. I'm always reluctant to give a synopsis because part of the pleasure of reading books, and especially novels, is to enjoy the plot as it unfolds. So I'll just ask you to tell us whatever you'd like to tell us about your book and what it's about.
Sober Repetition is about the fragmentation of identity after immigration. But really, it's like about when your younger self comes back as a ghost.
So The Other Valley, I guess you could call it speculative fiction, although everybody I talk to has a different gloss on its genre. It's set in a small town beside a lake, and over the western mountains, the exact same town reappears, except there it is 20 years in the past. Across the eastern mountains, it's the exact same town, but there it's 20 years in the future, and so on and so forth, apparently ad infinitum. This story is about a shy 16-year-old girl who notices some visitors to her town, because one of the conceits of this is that although travel is usually prohibited between these towns, you can get permission to cross over into another town if you are grieving or dealing with loss of some kind. So for example, if somebody has passed away in your town, you can go back to the past with permission and see them again one last time in a place where they're kind of healthy and alive still. And those visitations are, you can't actually interact, you're not allowed to be recognized by the person that you're looking at, but you can stand for a little while and watch them as a kind of consolation. And opinions differ in the book as to whether it's actually consoling or not. This girl, though, she sees some visitors. She realizes they're here from the future. They must be here for some kind of morning tour, as it's called in the book. However, she then recognizes who they are, which is against protocol. And that is enough information for her to put together which one of her classmates must be about to die, well before his time. And so she possesses this secret that she can't tell anybody. She's sworn to secrecy about it. But instead of kind of steering clear of this boy, she becomes closer and closer to him. So yeah, that's all I can really say without spoilers, I suppose, about the setup of the book. But that's what it's about.
Fascinating, both of them. So as you can see, one of the commonalities of this book is this sense of repetition, the repeating valleys and the landscape in Scott's book, and in Lily's book, the repetition of imagery and the color silver in various places that she's noticing. And I think, Lily, it was a professor of yours who introduced you to the theory of repetition. Mm-hmm. Would you mind explaining what that is and how it's impacted your work?
Yeah, I took a course called Repetition. So essentially my professor and so on, who's retired now, he structured a course and a syllabus around what Kierkegaard sort of coined as the theory of repetition. So Kierkegaard has this book called Repetition and Philosophical Crumbs, and he has this idea where I can circumnavigate myself, but I cannot get beyond myself, this self-repeating trap of repetition. And it's also mostly a large historical problem where we keep repeating the same violence over and over, and how do we ever get out of that? And then from there, a lot of theorists write and think incredibly, and there's a lot of thinking around repetition and creation, repetition and how it's always different, but it's always the same. So that can be really fun. But I mostly was struck by this idea of looping and how perfect a loop is, and how you can, as someone with a fractured identity, ever make that kind of seamless movement. And when I think about fragmentation of identity, it's very much like myself, where I leave a country at an age where I have not developed a sense of family, culture, even language. Even language at that stage it's in bits. You're just learning to speak, and then you lose that. So you don't have an idea of what you've lost. So what exactly is the trap that you're repeating? So you can think about it in so many different ways, and this book is one exploration of that.
And Scott, as a philosophy doctorate, were you familiar with this theory, and did you consciously think about it during your book and creating the repetitive landscape inside that is the other valley and the other valley and the other valley?
No. So there is in philosophy, this is going to be an overstatement, but there's a bit of a stark divide historically between kind of continental philosophy, where Kierkegaard belongs, and then analytic philosophy, which is, that's kind of where I come from, that's my background, and it's got its issues. It's very dry. There's some figures who kind of span both, like Kant and that kind of thing, but for the most part, it's more like the logic choppy kind of part of philosophy. I had the pleasure of meeting Rachel Kushner a few weeks ago, and she said, "Oh, you did philosophy. My husband is a philosopher, but he's continental, so I've heard that you guys are the bad guys." And I was like, "Yeah, we kind of are." So I think the stereotype of the analytic philosopher is kind of like the aggressively incurious, kind of clever dullard, I think, and there is some truth to that. And I kind of spent my time within that world, but also fighting against it and trying to inject more kind of literary concerns into it. But this is all a roundabout way of saying that I feel in some ways like starved of the kind of theoretical background that you're talking about. Like I don't have a huge background in Kierkegaard, for example.
I guess I was asking about the concept of these repetitive valleys. Mm-hmm. Where did that idea even originate within you?
That idea, I don't know where it originated, but I know when it did, and I think that kind of gives a clue as to where. So I had a friend who was diagnosed with cancer, and she went into hospice. It was a long process of running out of treatments, and when she went into hospice, everybody was like, "Well, how can I get my last visit?" And we were sort of kind of in the middle to outer parts of that kind of concentric rings of grief. We weren't like the frontline people who were going to be there in the room, but all of her friends wanted to still see her because she was very popular. And then things progressed too quickly, and we weren't able to. And I remember sitting at my table and thinking, like, just trying to sort of work this out with her sister, like kind of create a spreadsheet of something that might be feasible for like when could so-and-so visit this place. And as kind of a random aside, my brain just thought, yeah, what if time travel was naturalized and there was a bunch of kind of towns that repeated infinitely? And I just thought, well, that's an interesting idea. I wrote it down, and then I just went back to the other work and didn't think about the connection between those things for several years, I would say. And now it seems just blindingly obvious that, the kind of personal context about visitation and mourning that has always been central to the premise of this book was clearly kind of coming from where I was at when I had that thought.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Both of the books start with love and with sort of young love and heartbreak in some ways. Can you talk about how heartbreak is a motivating factor for your protagonists and what it means for them in terms of what they're moving towards in the world? Lily?
I start. Well, first of all, I just need to say that I noticed that you guys are scared of sitting front row, huh? And repetition, I'm also going to cross my leg.
Oh, look at us.
I just switched legs.
We're a
so-
pattern.
Sorry.
Okay, ready?
But that's repetition and difference.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually wanted to start my novel very specifically with my characters on a date because I was so angry about like the type of short story that was always being published, like the hot short story. And I felt like that was a good trick to get people to read a sad book. But
It worked.
specifically with my character, Yue Yue, it's I've had lots of feedback about how, oh, we hate this guy that she's on a date with and we want to protect her, and it's very sweet. I love that. But she's also a character where you can't trust her, and she's making these decisions. She's putting herself in these situations where she's naturally going to get hurt if she spends time with someone who isn't respectful or isn't kind. And these moments of heartbreak and moments of hurt, they're always a chance to reflect on why it is someone is so desperate for something, and to analyze that. And for her especially, it helps her realize, just sitting with that pain helps her realize she has all this hurt inside of her that she's never really parsed through, and she's seeking validation or affection from a specific source, and what that kind of source is, and what the person she's on a date with, Johnny, what he represents, this stability or belonging in a kind of society that he represents, it all is necessary self-reflection and self-making that I wanted her to go through.
And how about you, Scott, with heartbreak as a motivator for Odile?
I think I'm kind of a sucker for the bittersweet as a tone. I think it was probably inevitable that I would have driven a book towards that kind of feeling. I think specifically for Odile, what your question makes me think of is how so much, like she has this one little chance at happiness at the start of the book. So when we meet her, she's a terrible loner, basically. She is a damaged person who doesn't talk to anybody, and to the point where she stands by herself outside of the cloakroom door of her school rather than talk to anybody else. She just stands there stiffly all day and until lunch is over, and then she goes back inside. So she's that type of person. She's that kind of buttoned up. And what I enjoyed doing in the first half of the book, when she's 16, because there's like sort of a time skip, and she's an adult later on in the book. But in the sort of adolescent section, I liked maybe I just am a sadist and I like to torture her, but I think that it was nice to kind of predicate her happiness on something terrible, and put kind of an expiration date on that happiness. So that the thing, as I mentioned earlier when I was giving the little rundown of the plot, that kind of allows her to start blossoming, to actually start to talk to somebody in her class, is the possession of this terrible foreknowledge about what's going to happen to him. And it's interesting psychologically to explore, why it is that she does this, why that kind of secret allows her to actually break out of her shell. And she reflects on it in the book herself. She's not quite sure why she does this. She wonders if it's something wrong with her. But in any case, yeah, I enjoyed sort of working with that tension, where her, the happiness is kind of all got this ticking time bomb of heartbreak underneath of it.
Yeah, I think we all have this. At least when I read books, I always am like pulling for them to find love. So it's definitely something that propels both of the books forward. And time, you mentioned time, and time is a very, very big motif in both of these books. And without giving too much away, I'll say that some characters witness themselves at different parts of their life, either earlier or later in their lives. And it's fascinating. It kind of hurts your brain at times to try and figure out how it's all happening. It's like that everywhere, everything all at once kind of feeling. But I wondered if you could just talk about time and your intentionality with working with time inside these novels. How about Scott first?
Yeah,
Alright,
take it
you're-
away, Scott.
You're not on the front line. I'm gonna give the lowbrow answer. I think. I think that I have been a fan of time travel fiction for as long as I can remember. People of my generation, it's Back to the Future is one of the big films. And I think that between that and sort of some Star Trek The Next Generation episodes, because I was a little nerdy 80s kid, those things kind of just lodged in my brain. And no matter how much kind of philosophy and lyric poetry I sort of filtered those interests through as an adult, still when I came to write a book, it ended up being kind of an elevated version of that same stuff. So I think that's maybe where the fascination with time comes from. It comes from like this deep childhood place. I think also though that like emotionally, if I was to reflect on why those themes resonated with me as a kid, there's just something inherently poignant about time travel, about seeing the past. And even, in your book too, where it's not about time travel so much, but about this kind of haunting, or this like younger doppelganger that follows the protagonist around, there's still something so poignant about every time that she's in the scenes, And so I think that maybe that kind of just emotional hook got in me at some point.
So, if you could time travel, would you go to the future or back?
In the past.
And what would you do?
I don't, where would I go or what would I do there? Or both.
And anything you're willing to share.
I got this answer really right at one point when I was talking to the Swiss publisher of this book. He asked me this, and I said I'd probably go to New York in the late 70s for the music. Just like that confluence of like the downtown art scene and disco and hip hop and punk and new wave all happening at the same time and overlapping. And he was just like, yes. Like, okay, so this guy knows. That's probably what I would do. I would just go to a lot of shows.
How about you?
Well, when I was a kid and everybody was first watching movies that had time travel in them and I had to think about this, I just don't want to think about it. I don't really like thinking. I'll just live today.
That's fair enough. That's the attitude of a lot of people actually in this book too.
When I picture the actual topography of the valleys, it makes me think of time zones here, though. I mean, just hour by hour and not generation by generation. And it always messes me up. Like, obviously, jet lag is a thing, but it's more than that. It's like my daughter just flew back to Vancouver from the Philippines, and she arrived before she left. And that's just like how is that even possible? And the way that you both treat the opportunities within that. And I'll ask you, I guess, Lily, what does it mean to yue? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been practicing. To be able to have that opportunity. I know you said you don't like to think about time, but you started it with your book. How does that concept of being able to skip backwards work with you in terms of developing the character?
Well, first, to go back to your earlier question, my relationship with time in the book comes from a personal lack of a sense of time. I'm always confusing the day for a different day, and it's how at least I experience the present is always, you always have your memories with you. You always have all of your time with you, whether it's accessible to you in the present or not, they're part of you. And so the present is always, it's different for everybody. Sometimes it feels more like it's superimposed with different times, or sometimes they're like meshed together. And for Yuya, it's much more of different pieces, different fragmented pieces that sometimes glow stronger than other pieces do. And for her, it's moments where she is having a flashback, where she's remembering a scene that the narrative feels most grounded and most like it has weight or gravity to them. And she is so desperate for those moments of memory. She's always trying to recall something. And when her younger self comes back, it forces her to also remember the parts of her life that she doesn't want to remember, the parts that she can't really romanticize, sort of to say that, like I was saying earlier, these are all part of who you are. They'll never leave you. And she doesn't even have to accept these parts of herself. Being as whole as you can be and as present as you can be, sometimes it's just acknowledging those parts that are in you.
And I guess, Scott, it's that the characters have the knowledge that they exist in these other time zones, whatever you want to call them, chapters. What do you call them? Valleys.
I would just say other valleys.
Other valleys. In the other valley. They are aware that they exist in the other valley, previously and in the future. What does that do to the psyche of a person when you're writing them?
They're aware that they exist in the Western Valley, which is 20 years in the past, as long as they're over 20 years old. And they actually have kind of a mawkish ceremony that's kind of an old-fashioned custom in the town for when you turn 20. That is also the time, that's also the exact day and time that you're being born across the Western Mountains for the first time. So they have this kind of, well, a lot of the characters in the book kind of scorn it as a corny ritual, where they're supposed to like look at the Western Mountains and reflect. From then on, though, yeah, then they know that they exist in the Western valleys, and if they have a good recollection or if they kept a diary, they will know exactly what they were doing on any given day. They don't know necessarily that they still exist in the East, because any of us might die tomorrow. So there is a little bit of heightened anxiety when the kind of military police, the gendarmerie, escort visitors to the Eastern Valleys. They're often kind of like keeping an eye on whether they see themselves when they're there, because everybody's kind of wondering, am I still around? And so that's kind of a source of anxiety in the book. Yeah.
I think that in a lot of respects, writing about memory or thinking about memory or even being aware of our memories, it's such a nonlinear way of thinking anyway. I mean, if you saw the talk with Sheila Heti, she talked about this a couple of weeks ago were you here? No, did you watch it?
No, I heard about it and was jealous.
It was fascinating. She talked about how time moves in a chronological fashion, but our memory doesn't work that way. And often I find with memory, it is focusing on some regret or some kind of disappointment or even looking back to the person you wanted to be and didn't quite, that kind of longing feeling. And would you speak about the correlation between memory and longing, or perhaps, I don't know, rejigging of it seems like memory is a pain in the ass sometimes. Like you're just always trying to fix things. Does that make sense?
Fix things how, do you mean?
Well, I just mean trying to, looking back at what went wrong.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, everything went so right for me.
Oh.
I'm just joking.
The longing part, the things that maybe you wish were different.
Well, I think I'm not someone who regrets my actions because I just try to learn from them. And so I've never personally felt like I wish something had happened differently. I am just so grateful to have any bit of memory that I can have, and my feeling of longing. And I'm thinking about this really in terms of the difference between nostalgia and melancholy, where I definitely am more melancholic and I don't feel like I really feel nostalgia. And that's also what I wanted to explore writing Silver Repetition is I don't have a sense of roots or a past that I could feel nostalgic for because I'm so used to, since being a kid, always longing for an idea of things. So longing for an idea of what it's like to have family in this country, where to feel like I belong, or in school or something like that, which there's so much longing constantly that it's just actually just melancholia and not longing at that point. And so when I do think about the past or memories, it's just so overall just so beautiful and so special. And I think that's the feeling of longing.
Yeah, it's interesting to distinguish kind of the immigration experience from nostalgia, because there are so many people who are theorists of nostalgia who talk about, for some reason especially, from like sort of a post-Soviet experience of like leaving the USSR and then, you know, finding themselves extraordinarily nostalgic for, you know, that world. But I mean, it always depends on how we define nostalgia, you know, whether it's like an current desire to actually return or to resuscitate the past, or whether it is something more closer to what you're calling melancholy, I think, where it is just like abiding in the desire without any kind of intention to try to restore in any way the past that has been lost. Yeah, I think that the role of longing and memory is pretty strong in this book. I had studied some of that stuff as a philosopher, and some of the kind of content that I was trying to insert into the bland analytic philosophy landscape that I was describing earlier.
It's not bland.
Well, I mean, not this stuff. I was inserting it into a landscape that was kind of was bland. Yeah. I think that when I came to write this book, I sort of took a pleasure in bringing back some of those feelings that had been so kind of, I think, strange to the people who I was professionally kind of in communication with as a philosopher. They always just thought, why are you talking about Proust? Why are you talking about Virginia Woolf? Why are these people showing up in your papers? And or, you know, Philip Levine. And it was nice to kind of finally be writing in a place where these kinds of emotions, like longings that you're talking about, are actually kind of just, you know, treated as a given. You know, this is the natural subject matter of literature, as opposed to an unnatural subject matter for analytic philosophers.
You mentioned immigration, which I definitely want to get to, but we'd love to hear you read from your books, if you would please. And I think you decided you want to go to the podium, or would you prefer to stay here now?
Oh, the lectern?
The lectern.
The lectern.
Like you're running for office.
Mm-hmm.
Or walking for office.
Are we
Where would
going
you
to
be
fight
most
each other to
comfortable?
go first? Or you?
You can decide.
Oh.
Or we can fight also.
You want to do rock, paper, scissors?
I'll go first. But I've been taking a POV photo from Lily's POV. Can I take a POV photo?
Get that microphone in there.
Yeah. I gotta cross my legs for realism. Okay.
Okay.
Hello?
Perfect.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I can't really actually see. Oh, wow. Okay, you don't need context for this. The basement we lived in belonged to a family that, like us, had emigrated from China. The family consisted of a man, his wife, their 5-year-old daughter, and the man's 2 aged parents. The man I knew as our landlord worked as a hairdresser at the mall. He had a raspy voice that he was insecure about, and as a result always carried a bottle of water with him. I never saw him without his water bottle, sucking on the rubber straw between every few words to moisten his throat. That straw almost never deserted his lips. He once intercepted me on the porch when I was coming home from school. He was standing there jabbing slices of lemon into his water bottle. "How about you, Yue Yue?" he asked. "Do you have a favorite singer?" I was silent, fidgeting. He smiled and gave the cap on his bottle a hard twist. "My Baba is a good singer," I said. "Oh?" The landlord peered down at me, his eyes orange in the afternoon sun. "Since you're just a child, you wouldn't have an ear for what counts as good singing. But you should be praised. It's good, very good, to have so much devotion to your parents." He sucked on his lemon water. "As for my daughter, it's better that she doesn't say impulsive things." After he said this, he held the door open for me to come in. The landlord's wife was a computer technician who worked at the same mall. The electronics repair shop she worked at not only provided service at a fraction of the regular cost, but also sold pirated CDs in flimsy plastic sleeves. Once a month, the woman would bring home a plastic baggie of movies for her daughter to watch, and her daughter, a rather clingy girl, would invite me to watch them with her. She would tell me to wait for her at the foot of their staircase while she ran to grab the movie she wanted. Waiting with nothing to do, I'd find the woman leaning demurely against the sliding doors, smoking a cigarette. I'd follow the woody smell into their living room, inching my way past the coffee table, the couch, the glass cabinet full of plates. If the woman saw me at those times, she never said anything. Watching those pirated movies always made me feel strange. I had no idea the movies were illegally recorded at the cinema, and the ghosts I thought were in the movies were in actuality the silhouettes of unsuspecting audience members. I was never allowed to go upstairs with the girl. Whether we were watching a movie together or drawing with crayons, it would have to be in their living room or our basement. The girl's grandparents especially did not like seeing me in their house, using their furniture. Once, the old woman even said, "It's only because we're from China, too, that we'd be so kind as to let people like you live in our house." I didn't know what she meant by that. Because my mom had been a doctor when we were in China, the landlord's family was always coming down to ask her opinion on things. They'd wake us up in the middle of the night because their daughter had caught a cold and wet the bed. I'd press my pillow over my ears and still hear the circular beating of hearts in our basement. Still hear the old woman saying, "People like you," in Mandarin, 你们这种人. Dandelions grew in the plume grass. The hills shone yellow. We woke to a snowstorm of seeds whenever spiders dreamt of silk. Pitch dark, without any moonlight, the old woman's face rushes forward in my memory. The pale view of her high cheekbones is beautiful, and her slanted nose, and those upward tilting lashes. But isn't it a young face? Whose face am I remembering? I remember one incident, a lost earring. The landlord's entire family spent the day searching. I could hear their raised voices through the floor. They were shuffling the furniture and stomping up and down the stairs. A full hour passed before things finally quieted down and there came a rapping on our basement door. I opened the door and came face to face with the landlord's daughter. Her eyes were large and white. Floating above her was her grandma's face, large and white. Little girl, did you take it?" Nothing terrified me more than that voice. "No," I said. "Don't just say no," the old woman scolded me. "You only know how to say one word in English. Are you stupid?" "I didn't steal it," I said in Mandarin. It wasn't me. 不是我. Sound hatched on my tongue. I imagined syllables that grew 6 centimeters in length. Fast swimmers. They needed oxygen to survive. Chemical cues allowed them to recognize each other. A silver species of language, a shoal of words, a repetitive pattern used to prolong, respond to, substitute for, preserve. 不是我. 是 is a perfect syllable. Singular, whistle quick. 是, used before nouns to identify, describe, amplify. Used after nouns to denote place or position, to express existence. 是, response, yes, correct. 是. My mom pursed her lips. 是. It's so hot, even the cicadas are suffering. 是. 2 weeks after the plum rain season ends, black cicada pupae emerge into adults. They can be found in the flower beds and in the trees, in the treetops, in willow trees and privet shrubs, almost transparent, breaking through murky shells. 是, wet. Black cicada completing eclosion. See how the cicada stretches its thin crystal wings. Long-horned grasshoppers in rattan-woven cages. Bright green crickets on 是 leaves. That was longer than I thought.
Thank you. Thank you, Lily. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay, Scott, would you please do us the honor?
That's how tall this thing is. Okay. So for a little bit of context, Odile, the protagonist, 16, she is showing up for the first time at what is called the vetting program to be part of the Conseil. The Conseil is the kind of governing body of this town, and her main job, if she was to get this position, would be to hear various citizens' petitions when they're requesting to travel, usually to the past, sometimes to the future. So these grieving citizens, they would be met with a panel of people, including Odile, and she would decide whether their case merited this travel. And this is basically, she's showing up for the first time to try out for this position. And it's already kind of a coveted situation for her to be able to do that. The foyer was cool and funereal. The rug on the floor was oddly soft. There was a vase of pink flowers with petals like animal tongues. A handwritten sign directed candidates to go upstairs, where I could hear low murmuring voices, the sound of being early. I touched the wooden banister, which was worn, shiny, and smooth. Reluctantly, I followed the sign. The stairway narrowed as it curved upward to the second floor. From a sunlit landing, I saw a classroom that seemed to have been fashioned out of an old parlor or sitting room, though I could never quite say what gave me that impression. The entire far wall was taken up by the oval window I'd seen from the square, and the rich wainscoting on either side gleamed with afternoon light. A dozen school desks were arranged close together. Resting on each was a pencil and a leather notebook imprinted with the cryptic angular icon of the Conseil. 6 or 7 students stood clustered in the corner, all wearing the burgundy blazers of the downtown school. They looked at me and resumed their conversation. I crossed the room and stood waiting on the far side of the window, not wanting to sit yet, in case seating was assigned. At the front of the parlor was a chalkboard, murky green like lake water. On the wall beside me was a large topographic map of the valleys. It covered much more terrain than the engraving in my mother's book. Here I counted a dozen lakes in each direction, with intricate details in the mountains. The map showed the border fences, represented as raised silver lines enclosing the towns and some surrounding land. The enclosures formed loose circles, crossing the lakes to capture a crescent of each western shore. The town in the middle of the map was unlabeled, but the foreign valleys to the left and the right bore their proper names, written in neat type and accompanied by what I realized were temporal designations. West 1, minus 20. West 2, minus 40. West 3, minus 60. East 1, plus 20. East 2, plus 40. East 3, plus 60. Studying the series, it occurred to me that although the valley where I lived was in the center, that was only relative. In the eyes of the others, theirs would be centered, and mine would be off to the side. Somebody's future, somebody's past. Therefore, however different everything else must be in those distant places, the map on this wall would look exactly the same. I shaded my eyes and peered out the window. Below, Jo was arriving with her father. He hugged her goodbye, she slipped out of view, and I heard light footsteps on the curving stairway. When she saw me, she gave a quick wave and went straight to the others, absorbed into their circle despite her North End uniform. The last few students arrived and joined the group until there were 11 chatting at one end of the window and me standing at the other. A side door opened and the room went quiet in a single hitch of breath. A small woman entered. She was middle-aged and sharp-nosed and wore her hair in a long braid. She was dressed in the formal obsidian robe of the Conseil and announced herself as Madame Everett in a voice as trim as a paring blade. Everyone hastened to stand beside a desk. I ended up in the back corner next to the wall map, Jo in the middle of the room. We stood still as the concierge looked us over. The light from the window made her face appear cast in amber. She told us to sit and held up one of the notebooks. The things we will be discussing in this room are not to be discussed with others. This notebook is for you to use until you are dismissed, at which point you will return it and any other notes to me. As for dismissals, a minimum of 3 of you will be eliminated each Friday. After 3 weeks, the candidates who remain, if any, will begin apprenticeships at the Conseil and may one day become concierges. The girl seated in front of me, mussy-haired, raised her hand. Everett paused, her features impassive. Madame, it's already Wednesday, so do dismissals start this week? Everett stared at her. Did I say every Friday? Yes. Do you anticipate a Friday this week? The girl's shoulders sank. Chastened, she opened her notebook, and the rest of us did the same, glue cracking in a dozen nervous spines.
Beautiful. Thank you, Scott. You can see the skill of developing these characters. You really get to know them all so thoroughly. It's beautiful. I did want to bring the conversation back to immigration and migration. There's a lot of movement in these books, and these characters change a lot when they move from one place to another. And I guess, Scott, I'll start with you. In your book, the idea of migration from one valley to the other can be quite dangerous and alienating. It's not without risk, let's put it that way. I wondered, how did you decide which risks were worth it for your characters? And there's a great deal of tension when these visits are happening. It's such an interesting concept. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I think some of this is just kind of logically entailed, as well as one of the better time travel tropes that you can't really avoid if you're working in the genre, which is the concept of mucking up your present by monkeying around in the past. So I think that the kind of example of this is Marty McFly's hand starting to disappear, you know? And let's not get into all the ways in which that doesn't really make sense, but the basic idea does make sense, which is, you know, it's the grandfather paradox. You know, if you go back in time and, you know, harm one of the conditions, like one of your ancestors that, you know, on whose existence your existence relies, you might undo yourself. So when you're talking about the fraughtness of travel, that is one of the main concerns, or probably the biggest concern, is that when these parties go back to the past to just do something on compassionate grounds, like view a lost loved one, if anything goes wrong on that trip, it could have drastic effects for both the viewing party themselves, but also their entire home valley, their own present. So yeah, I don't know, I kind of liked, on a symbolic register, I kind of liked erecting this kind of like edifice of security and violence around the border as a kind of gesture at the difficulty of remembering some things, so this is maybe the more symbolic answer to that question. I think that it's interesting to kind of figure the past as a place behind barbed wire, because at least in this book, so much of the reason to go back is for grief, and grief is kind of this unspeakable, awful experience. It kind of made sense when I was writing this to kind of use the language and the imagery of kind of policing in a way to gesture at that, which is maybe perverse of me.
We've been talking about grief quite a bit, but neither of these books are sad. They're very exciting, and they move really quickly, and they're super engaging. So I don't want you to be thinking, oh, these are a couple of sad books. We're gonna have a few more questions, but if you have questions, I'd like you to start formulating them so you're ready to ask when we do go to audience questions. Now, Lily, for you, this idea of immigration and the fracturing of self and identity. There's one scene, there are a lot of beautiful scenes, but there's one where the protagonist's sister is born in Canada, and she's given a Chinese name, and the family is welcoming her, and then a nurse comes in and asks what's her name, and the dad just says Emily. And that really struck me about what it must be like to have two names and to have to change your name in order to be called it in a new place. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I had a very jarring experience with that, and I used my own personal experience with the name change in this book. I remember being so proud. I just learned how to write my name in Chinese. Like, it's so hard. There's all like these strokes, you draw a picture. So I was so proud of myself, and I wrote my name on my homework. And my teacher kept telling me to do it over. And I didn't understand English then. I just knew I was doing something wrong. So I would erase it and write my name again. And then she would tell me to erase it, and I would write my name again. And she was just standing there pointing at my name and watching me erase it over and over for about like 5 minutes until I, was crying on my homework. I didn't know what I was doing wrong. And she didn't know how to communicate with me either, and she left. And it was just that I was just left there crying on my homework, and I realized after the fact that she wanted me to write my English name, but I didn't know that. I had just come to Canada. And now it's really fun. Like, Lily isn't even technically my real name, so I could just disappear, and that's also a lot of this progress of being able to take a step back, having enough distance to be able to step back from those moments of hurt and see how, well, the teacher wasn't trying to hurt me. She had none of that experience or none of the tools available to her at the time to know how to properly care for a kid like me, and to look at memory from all those perspectives and from the future, and then decide how I want to feel about it now or who I want to be now based on those things.
Mm-hmm. And I think, am I correct that Yue doesn't have an English name in the book, or at least it's not identified? Why?
Yeah, it's never revealed. From like a secret between me and the people in this room, I'm really bad at coming up with character names. The way I do it is I go on Facebook and I refresh who you may know, and I just take a name. So I try to name as little people as possible, but mostly also because in Chinese, in Mandarin at least, you have your xiaoming, which is your nickname, but it's not really a nickname. It's more precious and it's more intimate than that. So your family calls you that instead of your legal name. And so Yue Yue, it's a xiaoming. It's what you call someone if you are familiar with them, if you love them, and you tell people you're Xiaoming if you trust them. And so the main cast in this book and the only people who refer to her are her family. And so I never reveal her English name, which she is known by the, outside world.
Even that boyfriend, non-boyfriend doesn't call her by that name. So that's why we don't like him.
Yeah.
That's one of the
Well,
reasons.
can
we
I
don't.
ask, if you found your names on Facebook, is there like a friend named Johnny who's not happy with you?
Well, actually, Johnny, I named after, I was going to keep this one a secret, but I'll share it. I was taking a lot of walks. I wrote most of this book during the lockdown, so I was walking in a lot of circles. And in the park I was walking, there were these porta potties called Johnny on the Spot. Yeah. I'm sorry to all the Johnnies out there.
And Scott, your character names are largely Francophone names, it seems to me. Why?
That's kind of an overdetermined question in a way. Like, I have a lot of answers for it. I think that, so yeah, if you read, Odile, Edme, Conseil, there's a lot of French in the book. There's also there's some Italian, there's some Spanish, there's some Maltese names too, but the main naming conventions are French. And I think that I have kind of a two-stage thought about this, because I get asked about it frequently. I think that I have kind of like a natural selection view of literary creation where, you start out with just random mutations, which is just kind of tossing stuff into your manuscript and just seeing what sticks. And then the kind of survival of those things depends on whether they function in your book, whether they're actually doing a job. And the reason that I threw the French stuff in the first place was because the landscape of the Okanagan, where I grew up, is something that I ripped off for the landscape of this book. And it's a weird landscape, You've got like these deep glacial lakes, and they're very lush down near the water, but then they quickly become these arid, barren sort of pine mountains. And that was something that when I was traveling in the southern Mediterranean, I sort of recognized a little bit of in the landscape there. And so I think the thought was like, oh, maybe I could just take some of this language and pop it into mine and see if I like it. I was also editing a book about like the cartography of Paris at the time as like part of my day job, and there were some great names that I just wanted to keep on using, like Edme. So
name.
you're just writing is just stealing. That's the basic answer. And I think the reason that it stuck around into the the finished product was because I liked kind of how it hovered between familiarity and unfamiliarity. I was trying to make a speculative world that was nonetheless felt pretty familiar. I didn't want to go all the way into sci-fi fantasy naming conventions that were going to be words without earthly precedent, basically. I wanted it to feel like, I recognize this stuff, but it's also not necessarily what I, as an Anglo reader, am used to on the everyday.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question, and then your questions. I always am so interested in objects. I guess they're nouns in books, and there are a lot of everyday minutiae, sort of moths and window screens and fish scales and rakes and things that are imbued with such emotion and characteristics in your book. Can you talk about some of the objects you chose? And with your book, Scott, for me it was the wood cuttings, and how, as an older character, Odile would make these painstaking, beautiful woodcuts, but of course when they're transferred, they're in reverse. And so I just wondered the significance of objects for you in both of your books.
Wow. Reversed wood thingy. That's repetition.
Yes, it is.
With everyday objects, there's a lot of very, very boring things in my book. I was losing my mind trying to figure out how to write, the same image of nature again and again. The mom tends to her garden a lot. Like, oh, I have to write about kale again. But each time in a way where I bring a fresh perspective to it, or not necessarily fresh, but imbue it with a different quality that is the power of repetition and you can think about that on a very stylistic, grammatical plane. And that's sort of why I wanted to challenge myself to remain with these very little objects like the rake or like mulch, or Yuya looks at the same tree all the time, or they sit at the same table all the time. Because for most of us, at least, we just have these things, a bland little kitchen, a tiny square backyard, and it's not always green, but that's your life, and it's so precious. And it's why I love poetry. Poetry helps us be grateful for the things that we see so often that we take for granted.
Thank you. And Scott, for me, there were the woodcuts and also the violin. They were two objects that really stood out for me as important and carrying a lot of meaning.
I kind of want to give a similar answer to Lily's, actually, when it comes to the woodcuts. It's something that Odile picks up as a kind of a hobby in the second half of the book, when her life, without spoiling anything, is not what she expected it to be. And so I think it kind of began as just I wanted to give her something to do, the same way that actors in scenes are always like, give me something to fidget with, give me some activity that I can base this performance around. But then it stuck around because I enjoyed having her practice attention in a way that in the rest of her life she doesn't. She is, when she's doing these engravings, she's like doing like block printing basically, and she's doing it while she's out and about. So she's got kind of, this is not actually how you do this, like nobody would do this in real life, but she takes a block and she's chiseling away at it to make these reverse prints later on by dipping the block into ink and then putting them on paper. She's doing this while she's kind of in the world, which is actually quite dangerous. You could slip. But I just really enjoyed the image of her attending so carefully to her environment and not taking for granted, the scene in front of her. So in a way, it was kind of a poetic, meditative practice for her too, which is one of the only nice things in her life in certain parts of the second half. Not that it's a bleak book; it's really so happy.
Super fun, both of them. Thank you both so much for your answers and your thoughts, your ideas. I'd like to turn it over to you now. I also have some questions from the people watching elsewhere. Does anyone have a question? Hi. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get right to you. Oh, just 1 minute, sir. We'll go over here first. Hi. Okay. Thank you, Jenny. The question is about intention versus interpretation, and if the authors wanted to give a warning or a note about the book before people interpret it.
I can start. It's an interesting process right now to be interpreting my own work, and I wonder if you feel the same way, that speaking about it in terms of answering, people are asking questions like, why did you do this and why did you do that? And it's actually, oftentimes, I don't know. And so the interpretation is kind of inhabiting a different role than the writer's role in a way. You kind of become your own journalist or critic too. And I don't really know how good of a job I do at it, to be honest. I feel like in some ways I'm always deflecting to some extent. But yeah, I don't think I have like a warning to give about the book. I think that just that your question prompts me to think about the kind of oddity of speaking about something that was creative and now kind of, in a way, marketing it. It is weird.
Yeah.
As we all know.
Becomes a commodity in some way. Yeah. Lily?
You've asked us such a kind question. I mean, to have a chance to say to someone how I want you to interpret my book, that's so, so lovely. I was actually talking to my wonderful editor, Shira Rose, about this earlier today, how scary it is to be just a person and to have readers, project onto you because you've written a story. And, Scott, we all know Roland Barthes' death of the author. Like, I know that once you write a story and it's out there, you have no control over how other people will interpret or receive your words. And this book, I paid so much attention to the experimentation of style, and I'm so hyper aware of every single comma choice, and I know exactly all the many layers of theory at work. It was based on my master's research on the theory of repetition, but I just need to, and I have distanced myself from the life that the book takes on its own, and I don't like every piece of art that I engage with, and our books won't be for everyone. But when it is relatable to someone, or even if it does something very small for someone, that is so unbelievably magical.
Hi, what's your question?
Yeah, the Chinese special name or personal name, where does that come from? Do you pick that for yourself or does someone do it?
The question is about the character Yue Yue's name and the Chinese character in the book.
Yeah, when you're born, the nurse asks you to pick. I'm just kidding. Your parents pick that for you. But actually it's very common in Chinese culture that later on in your life to just change your name and tell people I'm going by something different.
A question, I'll get right to you. A question from one of our streamers. At what point in the writing process for this book did you realize the story you were writing was going to become a novel? What set it apart from other projects or writing pieces that you've worked on?
The first thought I had about this story was that it would be, maybe I could try it as a screenplay. And then the next day I thought, that's going to be impossible. I wanted too much interiority in it, so I thought that was the format from then on. And that never really changed after that. So it was pretty quick.
Someone's going to have to make it a screenplay now, though.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that they offered me to try my hand at it, and I said no. I was like, I don't want that job.
How about you, Lily?
I had to. It was my master's. I had to graduate.
The deadline. Yeah. Okay, hi.
Yeah, I have a few different questions, but I'll start with this one. I'm curious about the point of view in each of your books, and if it was always meant to be that first person, or if you had experimented with something else before and then switched to first person.
Thank you. The question, and for the people at home, is about point of view and whether they were always meant to be a first-person narrator or if there were other iterations and it swung around to first person.
At the point of writing this book, I hadn't written a story from first person before. It was more, I wasn't committed to it. I would have switched if it didn't feel right, but it did help me channel some emotions into the character, and then it felt really right for this narrative because it's so emotion and experience heavy, and I want the reader to really be just right there, more than her shadow, but to be aligned with her completely in a way where it's asking for so much empathy that it's tricky to be able to peel yourself back a little and say, I can actually critique this character.
Scott, always first person?
This one was always first person, yeah. This was always a very kind of old-fashioned storytelling idiom, first person, past tense. I did this, I did that. And yeah, I'm not really sure why that was always obvious to me for it. I think that partly it's because, as I said, the character is very, she's very shy, and so it helped to be able to kind of get into her head in a very direct way, which I know you can do through third person, free and direct discourse, but I preferred it this way. And then the novel that I'm trying to write now is just absolute hell trying to figure out point of view. So I'd just be grateful for when it comes easily.
Another question here is about influences. Reading is such a big part of writing. This person asks, which writers inspire you in your writing, and books from your past that have influenced your writing today? And I would just add to that, not necessarily specific books, but style of books that influenced your aesthetic with these specific novels.
It's kind of getting colder, like for me at least here. Anyway, for
Do you need a hug?
Yes. For Silver Repetition, I drew most of my inspiration from poets. I love Victoria Chang, Ying Yi, but also I think Anne Carson mostly for this book, just from the way she uses psychoanalysis and theory in her poetry in a very, I would say accessible way, not necessarily like for our easy interpretation, but the way that poetry flows allows you to slip into theory, and you can be on that wavelength without necessarily needing a cognitive grasp on it that I wanted to do in this book. And in our edits of this, we've actually cut back on some lines that were too heavily theoretical and then maybe made it more poetic or more like a story. So my influences for this book were like every poet in the world.
Scott?
I guess I think that there were a number of novels that kind of, I felt like they were giving me permission to write the kind of book that I wanted to write. There's, I would distinguish between, there's sort of the influences. So for me, like Ishiguro's work, they're marketing it this way for a reason. Like he has a huge influence on the way that I write. I think there's also, distinct from influences, there's kinds of writers who just kind of, they can do that, so I can do that, something more along those lines. So Yoko Ogawa's The Memory Police was a book like that for me. Elena Ferrante, whoever it really is, the Neapolitan Quartet. The voice in that, the kind of fierce transparency of it, was something that I learned a lot from. Ted Chiang, as far as speculative goes, he's a short story writer for the most part, but it's extremely brainy, but it's also extremely heartfelt. And I had, I think, maybe assumed that those two things didn't go together. And then I saw his work and I was like, oh, they can, okay. So maybe those are the ones I'd name.
And there was a question, last question, no pressure, but it can't suck. It's got to be a really good question.
I wanted to ask you both, what has been the most exciting part about your debut? And if not most exciting, what's been the most surprising?
Thank you. The question is about the most surprising or exciting thing about publishing your debut book, novel.
Well, I'm in Vancouver for the first time because of this book. Thank you. It's just been so, I just want to be a hermit and like write my little thing. But when you have a book out, there are so many people who are so generous and so kind and loving. It's already brought so much friendship and new connections into my life. And that's my favorite part.
Yeah, I actually have the exact same answer. I think that's been more than
repetition.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I think that a lot of the kind of milestones that you see online, for example, are like the unboxing of your physical hard copies and for the first time. And for me, though, I think more than any of those, it has been just amazing to have it actually be meeting other minds, because a novel, and this is the same with any literature, it's kind of created by, as a collaboration between this text and then all of the different experiences and temperamental kind of inclinations that a different mind brings to this text. And so hearing about it from other people, and knowing that it's just kind of out there in the world, making friends with other people in a way that I'm not, is actually just, it's just so moving. Yeah, it's just really wonderful.
Making friends, making enemies.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
So many enemies. Scott and Lily, thank you both so much for being here with us this evening. Thanks to all of you for being here, for your attention and your thoughtful questions, and thanks to the people streaming as well. We really appreciate it. One big hand for these.
Thank you, Tara.